Imagine walking for miles in armor, your body exhausted, your stomach empty, and no modern rations in sight. Medieval soldiers had to survive on what they could carry, cook, or find. Their food wasn't fancy, but it kept them alive through battles, long marches, and endless sieges. In this video, we'll explore what medieval soldiers actually ate, how they cooked it in the field, and why their diet was the key to surviving war in the Middle Ages. Number 1. Bread, the soldier's lifeline. Bread carried medieval armies farther than any banner. Most soldiers ate coarse loaves made from rye or barley, not soft wheat. Wheat cost more and often went to lords or monasteries. The usual loaf was dark, dense, and a little sour. It filled the stomach and travelled well. That mattered on long marches. Men wrapped bread in cloth, slung it with their gear, and knew it would still be edible days later. When the crust turned like stone, they did not toss it. They soaked it in warm water, ale, or a thin stew, and brought it back to life. Many camps baked a mix known as maslin, where rye and wheat were blended to stretch precious grain. There was also horse bread. It was baked for animals with peas and beans, yet hungry men sometimes ate it during shortages. Trenchers made meals practical. A thick slice acted as a plate. It soaked up gravy and fat, then became food itself. On campaign, the army baker was as valuable as any archer. He managed flour, ovens, and fuel. Some forces hauled iron grates and clay molds to set up field ovens beside the baggage train. Others used village ovens under order or payment. Bread kept discipline steady. A full ration meant calm men and steady steps. A short ration meant grumbling and risk. In sieges, the oven was a heartbeat in stone walls. Millers ground whatever the garrison could find. Peas, beans, and even acorns were dried and milled into meal when grain ran out. The taste was harsh, but it kept men standing. Bread also carried salt and a little yeast nutrition, which helped bodies work under armor and cold rain. It gave reliable calories, packed tight, cheap to move, and simple to share. That is why commanders guarded flour like coin. With bread, men could fight again tomorrow. Without bread, no strategy held. Number 2. Pottage, the one-pot meal of war. Pottage was the go-to meal when you were moving with an army, not sitting at a banquet. It was essentially a big pot filled with what you could grab. Grain, vegetables, maybe meat scraps, sometimes just herbs and water. The army's campfire would have one or more large cauldrons where pottage simmered, and men gathered around the pot because it was warm, familiar, and reliable. Because armies travel light and fast, you can't carry fancy dishes or lots of individual ingredients. Pottage met that need. It didn't require separate breads, meats, veggies, all cooked differently. You dumped things in a pot, boiled them until they were cooked and soft, and everyone shared. This made it efficient in the field. Grains like barley, oats, and even peas or beans formed the base. Vegetables such as cabbage, leeks, onions, turnips were added when available. Even wild greens might get thrown in. Sometimes salted or smoked meat got chopped up and added to give the stew more protein and fat. On lean days, no fresh meat came, and the pottage might be thin and mostly grains and veggies, but it still filled bellies and kept bodies moving. Because you could keep the pot going for hours or reuse the same liquid by adding fresh stuff, it stretched resources far further than cooking individual meals. The smell of the pottage bubbling over the fire was often the moment soldiers paused, relaxed their shoulders, and felt that for a bit they were cared for. It fostered morale. In siege conditions, pottage kept soldiers alive when nothing else worked. You broke down animal remains. You used roots. You salvaged supplies and threw them in. The term mess of pottage comes from this tradition of sharing a bowl from a communal stew in the Middle Ages. It wasn't gourmet, but it was deeply functional. Its flexibility was its strength. You could add chunks of bit salt pork one day, or just vegetables the next, depending on what came in. Even the manuscripts from royal kitchens show that pottage was served at high tables, though with better cuts, spices, and broth, which underlines how central the dish was. For soldiers, a well-cooked pottage meant more than hunger-filled. It meant they could march. They could fight tomorrow. They weren't starving today. The ordinary ingredients, cooked simply, became extraordinary when survival was at stake. Number 3. Salted meat and preservation. Fresh meat did not travel well, so soldiers depended on meat that had been packed with salt or smoke before the march even began. Salt drew out moisture and slowed rot. That turned beef and pork into something tough, salty, and far more durable than fresh cuts. Quartermasters loaded barrels of brined meat onto carts and guarded them like pay chests. In warm weather, those barrels were the difference between a functional army and a sick one. When the day's ration came out, men often had to fix it before they could eat it. They rinsed or boiled the meat to pull out some of the brine. They cut it small and cooked it into pottage so the salt spread through the pot instead of blasting one bite. The taste was plain, but the fat and protein kept bodies working under armor and heavy packs. Soldiers valued bacon, lard, and rendered fat because those added dense energy to bread and porridge. Smokehouses near supply centers made sides of bacon and cured hams that could last many weeks. Fish filled the same role when meat was scarce or forbidden by fasting rules. Dried cod and salted herring were light, sturdy, and easy to portion out. You could break off a piece, soak it, and simmer it with onions or oats and have a steady meal. On the road, men looked for fresh meat in villages, but that was not guaranteed. Game laws protected the lord's forests and herds. Hunger still pushed men to poach rabbits or take a scrawny goat when officers looked away. In hard times, even the horse herd was not safe, though that was a last resort because horses were wealth and mobility. Salted stores, smoked cuts, and preserved fish gave commanders time. Time to reach a river crossing. Time to wait out a siege. Time to keep men on their feet when fresh markets lay far behind the banners. Number 4. Ale and wine, the drink that saved lives. When an army set up camp, the safest drink was often the one that had been boiled during brewing. Ale in the north and wine in the south did that job. Water near thousands of men and animals turned dirty fast, and stomach illness spread quickly. Ale was made from malted barley and yeast, and the mash had already been heated, so it carried fewer hazards than a raw bucket from a trampled stream. Most ranks drank small ale, which was weak in alcohol and meant for thirst, not for drunken nights. It worked like liquid bread. It gave water, a little sugar, and some B vitamins from the yeast. Bakers and brewers often worked side by side. The froth from one batch, called barm, kicked off the next, so a marching column with bakers could also keep ale going when grain and fuel allowed. In wine regions, soldiers leaned on diluted wine. The practice was simple. Mix wine with clean snow, boiled water, or even a bit of vinegar to cut sweetness and keep it safe. Strong wine appeared at the officers' tables, while the ranks took the rough stuff. Barrels rolled everywhere the army went. Coopers mattered as much as smiths, because a leaking cask was lost rations. Quartermasters counted casks by the dozen and kept them under guard. Men carried drink in leather costrals or wooden bottles and lined up for their measure from a ladle or dipper. On long marches, soldiers flavored sour ale with honey or herbs to make it easier to swallow. In colder months, they warmed it by the fire and felt life return to numbed hands. In hot weather, small ale helped more than plain water because men drank it steadily and kept salts coming in. During fast days, the church allowed ale and wine even when meat was off the table, so drink still moved through the camp kitchen. In siege lines, desperate garrisons brewed from tired grain or soaked stale bread to pull out fermentable sugars. Nothing was wasted. Hops spread from the Low Countries late in the period and made beer keep longer, which helped supply lines reach farther. A steady drink ration kept morale steady too. A man who trusted his cup would not fear the well. That trust meant fewer sick days, firmer steps on the road, and a better chance to stand his ground when the banners moved. Number 5. Food in sieges, starvation and desperation. During a siege, the real weapon often wasn't the catapult, but the breadbasket. When an army surrounded a stronghold, or when a city locked its gates, the flow of supplies stopped and time turned into the enemy. Initially, the defender still had stores of grain, dried meat, maybe salt, fish, and ale. But those stocks could last only so long. In historic cases, supplies ran out and men found themselves chewing horsehide or boiled leather just to stay alive. Inside walls, discipline cracked when rations shrank. Commanders split the little food they had, often feeding soldiers first so the walls stayed manned, and left civilians or camp followers with next to nothing. Outside the walls, the besieging force had its own problems. They had to maintain supply lines, forage, or steal food from the countryside, and avoid disease in cramped, muddy camps. If the attackers failed at that, the siege could collapse just as surely as a fort wall under bombardment. Famous sieges show what desperation means. The defenders sold weapons to buy bread. Soldiers deserted rather than stay starving and sick. Many chronicles record how people resorted to eating whatever they found: roots, hides, even bones ground into meal. The psychological effect of hunger became as deadly as arrows. Men grew weak, their morale died, and the will to fight vanished. Survival depended not only on strength of arms, but on food endurance. A city that held on for weeks weakened harder than its walls. A siege often ended when the men inside simply could not eat another day. Knowing this, commanders planned campaigns around harvests or attacked when the enemy's food lifeline was thin. In that sense, supply strategy mattered more than men in armor. Medieval soldiers learned quickly that it wasn't enough to have good swords and horses. They needed food, reliable rations, and the knowledge that tomorrow's meal might arrive. The face of hunger made the difference between standing firm and breaking. And for every fortress that fell, it wasn't always the battering ram. Sometimes it was the empty pot. Number 6. Faith, ritual, and the meaning of eating. In the Middle Ages, eating a meal in an army camp was never just about filling one's stomach. Every bite could carry a deeper meaning and help bind men together. Soldiers often gathered to eat in groups. They shared bowls of soup or bread and meat, and those shared meals made a company feel like a brotherhood. Religious rituals were also woven into daily eating. Before a march or a battle, some knights and soldiers would pause and say a short prayer over the bread and wine, asking for comfort and strength. The symbols of bread and wine had strong roots in Christian ritual. Bread stood for the body of Christ and wine for his blood. So when soldiers consumed these, even in a simple camp kitchen, it nodded to something greater. Fast days affected military life too. On Fridays or during Lent, meat and other rich foods were forbidden, but in practice, soldiers sometimes ignored strict rules because their bodies needed fuel. Still, the church's calendar shaped what was available and how men felt about food. In places where meat was off the menu, soldiers turned to fish or other alternatives, and this shifted not only what they ate, but how they thought about it. Discipline in the army often meant regular meal times and proper conduct at table. Commanders knew that when soldiers ate together well, they were more loyal and less likely to slip into chaos. Hunger, on the other hand, bred resentment, low morale, and breakdown of order. Knights might insist on eating only after the chaplain had blessed the meal, or that wounded comrades be served first. That act of service reinforced the idea that everyone was part of the same unit, and no one was left behind. From a psychological viewpoint, eating became an anchor in a world of battle and uncertainty. The smell of stew, or the sight of a warm loaf, told a man that for a brief moment things were safe. Such rituals handed back a little humanity to bodies hardened by combat and long marches. And for medieval soldiers, the meal at the table reminded them they were more than fighters. They were human beings with faith, duty, fear, and hope.